Thank you so much for getting up and getting here so early. What I want to talk about today is to look at the origins of Islam, which in a sense means the origins of the Quran, as history. So not in terms of what Muslims traditionally have believed, but about what the historical record seems to me to tell us about how and why Islam came into existence. The traditional story is that a prophet emerges, he preaches a new religion, the Arabs erupt out of the desert, and the Middle East has become medieval, it's become Muslim. That this idea that with what people call the coming of Islam, beginning of the 7th century, everything changes, cannot be true. The process must have been a much, much longer one, much more protracted and complex one. But if that's the case, why do we have this sense so strongly that the coming of Islam changed everything, that it was an absolute rupture? Well, I think the answer to that, essentially, is the incredible potency of what Muslims have come to believe about the origin of their faith. Because it is really the stories that Muslims tell about how Islam came into being that provide the defining template for our understanding of this period. So that even non-Muslims, up until about 40 or 50 years ago, tended to take the traditional Muslim account of how Islam came into being for granted. And the story is a very powerful one. AD 610 by the Christian calendar, it is said, a merchant named Muhammad in a cave above a remote and arid city named Mecca, in the depths of the Arabian desert, heard something as terrifying as it was awesome, the voice of an angel. And that voice delivered to him, direct and unmediated, a revelation from God. And it was the first in a whole series of revelations that would be delivered to Muhammad over the course of his lifetime. And these revelations, bundled together, would become the Quran. Were you to read the Quran and not know this backstory, it would not be immediately obvious, I think, that the only explanation for how it came into being was that it had been delivered by an angel. There are quite a lot of elements within the Quran that point to its emergent from pre-existent religions and cultures. For instance, it is full of characters from the Bible, both the Jewish and the Christian Bible. Moses is mentioned 137 times in the Quran. The Virgin Mary is featured more prominently in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. It features as well a number of episodes drawn from the history of the Roman Empire and the culture of the Roman Empire. It describes a story of 7 Christians who go to sleep in a cave to escape a persecution, wake up, discover that 100 years have gone by and the whole world has become Christian. This story, distorted, appears in the Quran. There is even a mention of Alexander the Great. So I think that if you read the Quran and you do not know the backstory, you would think this is recognizably a text that has emerged from a given place and a given time. But there's a problem in following through the implications of that because of what Muslims tell us about how the Quran came into being. Because what the key factor about the traditional account is that Muhammad receives his first revelations in Mecca, and Mecca stands at a fabulous remove from the world of the Roman Empire, from this culture, this melting pot of Jewish and Christian and Roman traditions. Mecca, we are told, stood in the middle of a desert, and its inhabitants, we are also told, are pagan. According to Muslim tradition, there are no Jews, there are no Christians in Mecca. There were not communities from which Muhammad could have picked up these stories, according to the traditional Muslim account. And what is more, we are also told by Muslim tradition, despite the fact that actually it's contradicted within the Quran, but we're told in Muslim tradition that Muhammad was illiterate. So there was no prospect of him curling up with the Bible, picking up a few stories, a few references to Moses or the Virgin. And if that's the case, if Muhammad comes of age in a city that is pagan, that is 1,000 kilometers from the frontier with Palestine, if he is illiterate, then how on earth are we to explain this text, which is full of all these sophisticated cultural references, except as a bona fide miracle? If the Muslim traditions that tell us about how the Quran came into being, where Muhammad grew up, what kind of city Mecca was, if those traditions are authentic, then there is essentially no way of explaining the origins of the Quran except as coming from some divine entity. Which, of course, is fine if you're a Muslim. But if you're not, you might well say, well, okay, these are interesting stories, interesting traditions. Where do they come from? What are their origin? What are their date? And this is where it gets interesting. There is a wonderful quote from Salman Rushdie, of all people, where he says about Muhammad, and he's comparing it to Jesus. He says, we know almost nothing about Jesus, but with Muhammad, we know everything, more or less. We know where he lived, what his economic situation was, who he fell in love with. We know what his favorite food was. We know how he liked to brush his teeth. We know how he liked to play with children. Incredibly intimate, personal details. But, is the rub, all this seeming wealth of biographical material dates, at the earliest, from about 2 centuries after he is supposed to have lived. From about AD 800, we start to get biographies. And over the course of the next 2 centuries, these biographies are written and rewritten. And the further from Muhammad's life we go, the more detailed these biographies become, which is a curious fact, and draws attention to the glaring lack of contemporary or even near contemporary biographical materials written by Muslims. So, within the lifetime of Muhammad himself, and for about 170 years after, you look for this source material and there is nothing. There is a glaring black hole. Now, this is not to say, as some scholars have, mostly in Germany, because in Germany scholars like these kind of outre speculations, but Muhammad, I think, did exist. There are those who say he didn't, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that he did. And the evidence is not Muslim, but generally Christian. Christians writing about the emergence of an Arab empire do name-check Muhammad. I mean, the most tantalizing one is written in 634, which is the year that the Arabs first appear in Palestine, the Roman province of Palestine, conquering it, so the onslaught of the Arab invasions. And this describes an unnamed prophet of the Saracens leading the invasion. And this must be Muhammad. But again, there's a kind of puzzle here because Muhammad is meant to have died in 632. And according to Muslim tradition, he does not lead the invasion of Palestine. And yet here we have a contemporaneous account, it seems, saying that Muhammad was alive, that he did lead the invasion, and he's there 2 years after he's meant to be dead, which kind of pinpoints the problem with squaring the accounts from Muhammad's lifetime with the stories that are told about him by Muslims much later on. And over the succeeding decades, so over the course of the 7th century, we do have histories written by monks, bishops, Christian chroniclers, a few rabbis, a few Zoroastrian priests, which do allude to an enigmatic figure whom they describe variously as the general or the instructor or the king of the Arabs. And I think we, again, can assume that this figure is probably Muhammad. And it's only in 690, so that's 60 years and more after the first Arab invasions of Palestine, that an Arab ruler finally gets round to inscribing the Prophet's name on a public monument. It's the Dome of the Rock on what is now Temple Mount, you know, the one with the great golden dome. And it's only decades after that that we start to get private inscriptions written in Arabic that mention Muhammad. And as I say, it's only in 800 that we start to get biographies written of Muhammad that have survived into the present day. There must have been earlier versions of his life, but they have vanished. And I think it's pretty clear why they have vanished when you read the very earliest biography of Muhammad that survived, written by a guy writing in Cairo called Ibn Hisham. He's absolutely upfront about the process of editing that he has done to write his biography. And he says that things which it is disgraceful to discuss, matters which would distress certain people, and such reports as I have been told are not to be accepted as trustworthy, all these things have I omitted. So he's basically saying anything that doesn't fit his understanding of who and what Muhammad was, you know, he's got rid of them. And what that was, we have no idea because it hasn't survived. If what the biographies of Muhammad tell us are true, and Mecca was an inveterately pagan city, devoid of any Jewish or Christian presence, situated in the midst of a vast untenanted desert, then how are we to account for the abrupt appearance there of a fully fledged monotheism, complete with references to Abraham, to Moses, and to Jesus? And this is the problem. And essentially, ever since Western historians began writing about the origins of Islam, this is the problem that they have had to wrestle with. And various explanations have been proposed, of which the most popular is that Mecca was somehow at the center of a great spice trade. It was kind of the Dubai of its day. And that Muhammad was a trader, and he went up, you know, in trains of camels, and he went to Jerusalem, and he went to Damascus, and he kind of picked up, you know, he heard rabbis and he heard Christian priests, and he picked up all this Moses, Jesus stuff, and then he just bunged it into the Quran. This is inadequate as an explanation. And it's inadequate for a number of reasons. Firstly, the relationship of the Quran to the Jewish and Christian scriptures is far more sophisticated. There are a lot of very, very sophisticated echoes in it. This is not a guy who is just overhearing something about Moses and putting it in. But more complex and more fascinatingly, it's evident that just from the evidence of the Quran, that Muhammad's opponents are not pagan. Muslim tradition says they're pagan. But when you read the Quran, it's a very disputatious text. It's basically God or the Prophet arguing with people who are called the mushrikun. And the mushrikun are the pagans of Muslim tradition. But from the evidence of the Quran, it's evident that they too are monotheists, that they too know who Abraham and Moses and Jesus are. And that essentially what is being argued about is the nature of God, not the fact that there is only a single God. So it would seem that the Quran, and therefore presumably Muhammad, is emerging from a culture that is steeped in a kind of biblical monotheism. And what's oddest of all is that many of the traditions, the Christian traditions in particular, that are being cited are very ancient. So there are all kinds of echoes and allusions to Gospels that had been banned by the Catholic Church that had come to power under Constantine. Texts that we only know of because they've been dug up in Egyptian deserts. and yet you find echoes of them preserved within the Quran. There are even, it seems, echoes of texts that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there seem to be kind of, it's almost like the Quran is a wall of sediment in which fossils have been embedded. And what are they doing there? Where have these ancient texts come from? And it's very, very mysterious. How can the Quran have emerged in this way if what Muslim tradition says about Mecca is true? And I think the answer, the way you cut the Gordian knot, is actually to say the Quran did not originate from Mecca, or at least Mecca that we, in Saudi Arabia, where it is now, where Muslims go on pilgrimage. Basically, they're going on pilgrimage to the wrong place. The evidence seems to me, and certainly not just to me, I am building this on the back of a lot of great scholarship. But the evidence seems to me to point to an origin for the Quran to the north of Mecca, basically along the desert frontier of Roman Palestine. Now, the obvious stumbling block here, of course, is, well, what about Mecca? Why do Muslims end up thinking that Muhammad came from Mecca? And again, the solution to this puzzle, I think, lies in the Quran, lies in reading the Quran, not in the context of what Muslims say about it, but just nakedly as a text in its own terms. And when you look at that, you find something very strange. The first is that there is only one mention of Mecca in the whole of the Quran. And it is not at all clear what Mecca is. It might be a city, it might be a village. It seems likeliest actually to be a valley. It seems to be a description of a valley. Only one mention. And then you look at other ancient texts for a mention of Mecca, and the earliest datable reference to Mecca outside of the Quran, when do you think it is? 741. So more than 100 years after Muhammad is supposed to have died. And do you know where Mecca is placed in this text that mentions it in 741? The deserts of Iraq. Not placed in Arabia at all. And then you look at the descriptions of the mushrikun, the opponents of Muhammad, the people who, according to Muslim tradition, are meant to have lived in Mecca. They are described as agriculturalists. They're described as farmers. They're keeping cattle. They're growing olives. They're tending vines. There are no cattle in Mecca. There are no vines. There are no olives. It was impossible for the olive that grew at that time to be grown in that far in Arabia. It was a Mediterranean crop. So the evidence seems to point to the strong likelihood that the opponents of Muhammad, at the very least, are living in a Mediterranean region. And then there is one final, I think, clinching clue, because just as the Quran does not mention great powers, great people, so also does it not really mention recognizable geographical locations. There are only 7 place names mentioned in the Quran. But there does seem to be one key pointer to where the mushrikun, and therefore by extension Muhammad, lived. And it derives from the story of Lot in the book of Genesis. You remember Lot is the nephew of Abraham, and he goes to live in the city of Sodom, and the Sodomites offend God for all kinds of reasons and are wiped out. And Lot and his family escape. His wife looks back and gets turned into a pillar of salt. And this appears in a kind of refracted way in the Quran. This is God speaking. Remember when we delivered Lot and all his household, except for an old woman who was left behind. Then we destroyed the others, i.e. the Sodomites. You pass by them morning and night. Will you not understand? You pass by them, the Sodomites, morning and night. So where were the Sodomites to be seen? Well, we know exactly where the Sodomites were to be seen, because in the early 7th century there was a chapel built to Lot on the site. It's on the southernmost tip of the Dead Sea, between what is now Israel and Jordan. And so if the mushrikun are passing these people day and night, then the implication of that is where Muhammad is having his arguments with the mushrikun that are recorded in the Quran. And so I think that that is the place to look for the origins of Islam. Thank you very much.